Hey guys, it's Kathleen, and today I'm going to be doing a discussion video on a topic very near and dear to my heart, and that is the subject of whether Booktube qualifies as journalism. I was inspired to make this video by two different things. First of all, I'm a journalism student, so I'm always interested in how journalism intersects with other fields, especially books, because that's the thing I'm most interested in. Second of all, I was inspired by the release of the recent anthology Because You Love to Hate Me, which featured a collaboration between 13 authors and 13 booktubers, and all resulted in one giant story collection. The collection received a lot of praise, but it also received comments from people who were saying that the booktubers are sucking up to the authors and to the publishers they're working with, whereas they should be criticizing them. And of course, this reminded me a lot of how we view journalism in society, so I decided that I would make this video and talk about it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to look at the definition of journalism. We're going to head over to our handy friend Wikipedia just to give us an idea. Journalism is the production and distribution of reports on the interaction of events, facts, ideas, and people that are the news of the day and that impact society to at least some degree. It would probably be fair to say that booktubers are producing reports on events and facts of the day and people, things that are happening in the world. They're just doing it specifically in relation to books. And that kind of reporting has existed forever. If you look at the New York Times, they have sections about books. If you look at BuzzFeed, they have whole sections about books, but those things can still be journalism. So the fact that they're kind of reporting about niche things doesn't necessarily mean they're not journalism. The other element there is that it impacts society to at least some degree. And this is a somewhat questionable term. I wouldn't say Booktube necessarily impacts society greatly. To some extent it does, and to some people it might, but I wouldn't say it has a great impact on broader society. However, I do believe you can divide impacts into little subsections. So for example, if I'm doing a story on a small community in BC, for example, I've gone to work there and I'm doing a story on that community of what their small church is doing. That might have an impact in that community. I could be telling this great story and that'll impact that community, but it's not going to impact society as a whole. The world isn't going to be impacted by this little story, and neither is even Canada. But that community could be very impacted by it. So I definitely think Booktube can still qualify in that sense, because booktubers can impact their community. So now we know what journalism is, and now we know Booktube kind of fits in with the technical definition of journalism. Let's look at what hard news is. So hard news is just the simple reporting of facts, what happened. Usually it relies on a lot of interviews with different sources to present an unbiased report. If you want to go by the standard formula, there's one side, the other side, and there's the expert. We were often taught in journalism school to figure out whether something is newsworthy. We were given a couple methods to do this. One we were given in first year is not really a very common method in the real world, but think of it as sinful. Something is significant, interesting, and new. Ha ha ha. If you don't have all three of those, it can still be news, but it does often lessen the value of it as news. Oftentimes you'll get two of the three, and that's good. If you have three, you've probably got a really great news story on your hands. So once again, I do believe that Booktube can be significant in its community, but it's not always significant in its community. It's not a basis for which it exists. Second of all, I think a lot of the things you see on Booktube can be interesting. Not all of them are going to be interesting, but they oftentimes can be. Thirdly, most of the time it definitely is new. We're usually not talking about the same thing over and over again, or it would get very boring very fast. So yes, arguably in a sense, Booktube is a kind of news, but it's not hard news. If we're going to call it journalism, we have to say that Booktube is primarily either fluff journalism or it's opinion. Now, I'm not saying that fluff journalism is a real thing, but if you're going to BuzzFeed, you're going to see articles like top 10 books that you should read this spring. And that's something you see in Booktube all the time. If you go in the Globe and Mail, if you go in the New York Times, they're all writing these articles about books, and they're not all hard-hitting journalism. Some of them are, but most of them probably aren't. They're just the everyday things that happen in the book world, and oftentimes that's just talking about new releases. The other thing you see most often is reviews. So that's something that's prevalent in both actual professional book reviewers in newspapers, and it's also completely all over Booktube as well. A lot of people don't think that opinion writing, which is what reviews are really journalism, but they definitely are. They're oftentimes an interpretation of things that are happening in the world. They are not the facts straight up themselves, but they are a type of journalism. And just because something is not totally unbiased, it doesn't mean that it's not journalism. So now we know that Booktube does fit into some of the technical definitions of journalism, and that in a sense it is a kind of news. And we even know the categories that it is if we break it down into the type of journalism that it is, which is usually either fluff writing or it's opinion writing. And this brings us to the next question, which is, if Booktube is journalism, as it seems to be, do we hold it to the same ethical standards that journalists are held to? And I think this is really the driving force behind this topic, and it's what was driving a lot of the opinions on the Because You Love to Hate Me Goodreads page. As some of you guys may know, journalists are held to different ethical standards than everybody else. One big one is that typically news reporters at least do not accept things for free. So if you go to an interview with, say, the creator of Nike, I don't know, you're going to this interview and you are there to talk to them and you are there to get the facts, but you are not there to accept free things. So if the creator of Nike then says, here, have this sweet pair of free shoes, you're not supposed to accept it. That's not okay. Of course, this is a complicated and very muddled topic. If somebody you're interviewing, for example, wants to buy you a cup of coffee, then okay, you might just say yes to avoid being rude. But in general, journalists do not accept things for free because that changes things. So you may be thinking to yourself, of course it's not journalism. Booktubers get books for free all the time, and they talk about them all the time. So how could it be journalism? The simple answer to that question is that journalists who review things in real life get things for free too. There's kind of a deal there between the two groups. Usually the company sending the thing accepts that they are taking a risk and that hopefully the journalist will say something nice about the thing they're sending, but they ultimately can't control it and the journalist doesn't have any obligation to review it nicely just because they got it for free. There's no expectation of that whatsoever, and it's a relationship that's always existed. So though you may feel like booktubers are automatically biased whenever they get something for free, in truth they're probably not. Opinion columnists are probably doing the same thing at some point in their lives. They get something for free for the purpose of reviewing. They don't get extra stuff. That would be unethical, but they do get that one thing free, they review it, they send off their review, and if it's positive and it looks good for the company. If it's not, it's not, and they can't do anything about it. So free stuff doesn't inherently mean that something isn't journalism, but there is something that could make it not journalism. And that is if specifically saying good things and encouraging people to buy the free stuff gets you money. And in this instance, we're going to talk about sponsored videos. Sponsored videos are a very controversial thing here on Booktube. Some people like them and accept them for what they are, whereas other people think that it completely damages a booktuber's credibility to do a sponsored video. Now, it's not uncommon to see sponsored things in newspapers and online news sites. There's something called custom content, which is when a person from the outside specifically pays to write their own piece that they're going to put in there, talking about the thing they want to talk about. There's also what are commonly known as advertorials, and this is when an advertisement is cleverly hidden within a news article. So a good example of this is an article I read a long time ago. If I can find it, I will link it down below, but it basically talked about another article that did a feature on women's prisons, and throughout the article they had pictures of the cast of Orange is the New Black and illustrations of people in orange jumpsuits, just like in the show. And it was subtly masking itself as a normal in-depth feature article, but really it was also an advertisement for the show. These types of things are very, very murky. It's very questionable whether they're really being accurate journalism, because journalism typically doesn't involve being paid to advertise someone else's stuff. So with good conscience, I cannot say that sponsored videos are journalism. Chances are, even if you say something bad, you're really gonna say something good on top of it to not damage your relationship with that company. So I wouldn't say that they're journalism in the way that other aspects of Booktube might be. And to discuss whether those other aspects of Booktube can be journalism, we're gonna take a look at sponsored reviews. Now, sponsored reviews are something that personally I think are some of the weirdest sponsorships, mainly because it's hard to do one where you didn't like the book, but you still say good things about it. So it's really, really hard for me to consider sponsored reviews journalism, just like I wouldn't consider advertorials real journalism, because ultimately this is someone who's getting paid to tell you about this thing. And ultimately, if a company is paying you to talk about something and to feature it, that means that you owe something to that company. And that, to me, is the big thing that really separates sponsored videos from journalism. When you're a journalist, you have a responsibility to the public, to your audience. You are held accountable by those people, but you're not held accountable by companies or government. They cannot control what you say. And obviously, I've never done one, but I imagine there's an expectation you're not just going to trash the book. You don't want to completely ruin your relationship with that publisher. And though I don't think sponsored reviews are a bad thing, I don't think they're journalism. If we're still looking at it in the context of journalism, chances are sponsored reviews would not exist. There's this expectation when you pick up a newspaper and you flip to the book section that it's going to be an honest, completely unbiased opinion, and it's not being influenced by the fact that the company has paid them. And ultimately, that leads me to my personal conclusion, which is that Booktube can be journalism, but we can't really expect it to be. So my logic for this is primarily based on the value that we place on Booktube and the value we place on journalism in general. So for example, we look at the CBC. The CBC is government funded, and most people consider that a good thing, that's an important, relevant thing in society, and that we need to maintain that. Ultimately, it's a public service and it's an investment in society to have it, so that's why the government invests in it and provides funding for it. But the same value isn't always placed on journalism. For example, if you look at most news sites, most people don't want to pay. Most people don't even want to remove their ad blockers in order to provide a little bit of funding for the site. And that ultimately means that we like journalism and we want to read it, but we don't want to pay for it. So if we look at that and then we consider the value that the public and even us place on Booktube, it's probably going to be quite a bit lower, because Booktube is generally viewed to be a less important thing in society than journalism, for good reason. For some people, Booktube is a hobby, and for some of us, watching it's just for fun, but at the same time, we forget that for some people, it's an extra source of income. I think it's unfair to say to somebody that you expect them to have the same ethical standards as journalism and be held to those standards throughout their entire video making career, but at the same time, say that you don't place the same value on it because you ultimately are not willing to pay for it. While sponsored videos aren't my favorite thing, I don't blame booktubers for making them, because at this moment, first of all, YouTube Red is not accessible to me in Canada, but also at the same time, I don't know if it would be worth the investment for me at this point in my life. So I can't blame booktubers for wanting to make the extra bit of money every so often, especially since for a very small portion of them, this is actually their job. It's what they do for a living, and I know that working with those companies and building those relationships is kind of an essential thing and a part of that. In conclusion, I ultimately think that certain booktubers can be journalists, but only if they hold their channels to a certain standard that it would be somewhat unrealistic to expect all booktubers to hold themselves to. Those are pretty much all my thoughts for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was a bit of a rambly mess, but nonetheless, I kind of enjoyed talking about it. Let me know what your thoughts on this issue are. If you personally think that Booktube is a form of journalism, let me know how you feel, especially about sponsored content. I'm really curious what you guys think about that. If you guys did enjoy this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe on your way out. If you would like to follow me on any of my social medias, the links will all be in the description. But in the meantime, I will see you guys next time.